By the first week of October, the water in Lake Geneva runs cold enough to stop a heart in under 20 minutes. Brooklyn Whitfield was 27 years old, 9 years married, and she was still wearing her diner uniform when she went under. She'd come straight off a double shift, hadn't even had time to untie the apron, because her mother-in-law had called it a family weekend. A chance to make things right. There were 4 people standing on that dock, and every one of them shared her last name. Not one of them took off their shoes. Not one of them reached out a hand. She came up twice, and she called her husband's name both times, and what he did next is the reason this story exists at all. But there was someone else on that lake that morning. A man swimming alone on the far shore. A man who came to that exact spot once a year and wouldn't tell anyone why. His name was Winston Marchetti, 38 years old. Quiet, patient, and the last man in Chicago you'd ever want to owe something to. He heard her. He didn't call for help, and he didn't send anyone. He went in himself. Nobody standing on that dock understood what they'd just set in motion. They thought they were getting rid of a problem. What they'd actually done was hand a woman with nothing left to lose to the only man in the state, powerful enough to give it all back. And he wasn't a man who forgot a debt, in either direction. If a story about someone pushed to the very bottom and coming back with everything speaks to you, hit that like button. It helps this channel reach more people. Share it with someone who could use it today. And subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single day. Now let's go back to that cold October morning on Lake Geneva. Marlene Whitfield opened the door before Brooklyn had a chance to knock, and that was the first sign. In 9 years as her daughter-in-law, Brooklyn had never once seen her mother-in-law waiting at the door for anyone. Marlene took her hand, called her daughter, asked whether the drive had tired her, then poured her a cup of coffee and placed it before her with both hands, as though she were serving an honored guest. Brooklyn thanked her. She sat on the edge of the chair, both hands resting in her lap, with the posture of someone accustomed to waiting for permission. Bradley sat across from her. He stirred his coffee for a very long time, though he hadn't put any sugar in it. Vivian leaned against the kitchen cabinet with her phone in her hand. Corey sat on the step leading out back, where he could see the entire room, and he didn't say a word. All 4 of them had been there since the night before. Brooklyn was the only one who had just arrived. Marlene sat down and said that the family had been through many unpleasant things over the past few months, that everyone said things they didn't mean sometimes, that she'd done a great deal of thinking, and that she wanted everything settled peacefully and decently, the way a family should settle things. Brooklyn nodded. She'd driven for 90 minutes from Chicago immediately after finishing her shift. She hadn't slept, and she'd believed every word. Then Marlene reached down to the chair beside her and placed 2 sets of papers on the table. The first was an uncontested divorce petition. The second was thicker, with a yellow sticky note marking the place where a signature was required, and Marlene pushed that one toward her first. She said Bradley's company was going through a difficult period, that the bank was putting pressure on him, that the whole family had discussed it, and decided it would be better for both of them to go their separate ways. But before they parted, everything ought to be divided fairly. Brooklyn didn't understand at first. She picked up the second set of papers and read the words at the top of the page. It was an authorization to transfer the entire balance from the account in her name into another account she'd never heard of. $180,000. $90,000 of it was the death benefit she'd received after her father died, the money the machine shop's insurance company had paid her when she was 18, after someone called to tell her that he hadn't made it out of the night shift. She hadn't spent a single cent of it. The rest was 9 years of tips, 9 years of double shifts, 9 years of folding money into envelopes and carrying them to the bank on Monday mornings. The account was in the name Brooklyn Kowalski, the name she'd been born with. She'd opened it before getting married, and had never combined it with anything else. That wasn't wisdom. It was merely the habit of an orphaned girl who couldn't bring herself to spend her father's money. But because of that, no one could touch it. Not Bradley, not the court, not anyone at all, unless she signed the paper lying on the table with her own hand. Brooklyn set the papers down and asked why they wanted all of it. Marlene said that for the past 9 years, this family had fed her and taken care of her, and now it was time for her to think of someone besides herself. Brooklyn looked at her husband. Bradley was still stirring his coffee. He didn't look up. She said his name, softly, and he still didn't look up. She turned back to her mother-in-law and said she would sign the divorce papers if that was what Bradley wanted. That she would sign them right now, but she wouldn't sign the other document. She said she needed that money to begin again, that she had no home and no one left, that it was everything she had. Her voice wasn't loud. She even apologized at the end of the sentence, out of a habit 9 years in the making. Over the next 3 sentences, everything in the room changed color. Marlene didn't shout. She simply stopped calling Brooklyn her daughter. She said Brooklyn had entered this house with nothing. She said some people were born without knowing how to repay kindness, and that she'd misjudged someone only once in her entire life. Vivian lowered her phone. Corey rose from the step. No one said anything more, and it was that silence that frightened Brooklyn for the first time that morning. She said she was leaving. She said she would sign the divorce papers and send them through the mail. Then she stood and reached for her car keys. Bradley still wouldn't look at her. He stared down into his cold cup of coffee, and after 9 years together, that was the last chance his wife would ever have to see his face inside a warm room. Marlene stood before Brooklyn could. She walked to the back door, opened it, held it with one hand, and her voice became as gentle as it had been when she'd welcomed Brooklyn at the front door. She told her not to leave just yet. She said it was too stuffy inside, that they should go out to the dock and breathe for a while, and then Brooklyn could leave if she still wanted to. Brooklyn hesitated. The fog outside was still thick, and she couldn't see across the water to the opposite shore. But she'd spent 9 years obeying that woman, and she couldn't find any reason why today should be different. She left both sets of papers on the table, and she went outside. The dock stretched about 65 feet over the water, its boards damp beneath Brooklyn's shoes, and she was halfway down it when she heard footsteps behind her. All 4 of them had come outside. Marlene led the way, still holding the second set of papers. She stopped 2 steps from Brooklyn and said she hadn't wanted to raise her voice inside the house, that it was more open out here, easier to talk. Then she held out the papers. Brooklyn said she'd already given her answer. Marlene told her to reconsider. She said Brooklyn ought to remember that she had no one, that she had no parents, no brothers or sisters, not a single relative anywhere in the state. She said each thing slowly, as though she were reading from a list. Brooklyn understood at once that those words weren't meant as comfort. She stepped back half a pace, and her foot touched the edge of a board. Marlene's tone changed. She said this family had put up with Brooklyn for 9 years, that Brooklyn had eaten at their table, slept beneath their roof, carried their name, and now she was clinging to $180,000, while Marlene's son was about to lose everything. She said that if Brooklyn signed, everything would end peacefully. Brooklyn would go her way, the family would go theirs, and no one would ever trouble anyone again. She said that if Brooklyn refused, then she ought to ask herself who would stand beside her afterward. She asked what money Brooklyn intended to use to hire a lawyer, where she planned to live while waiting for the case to reach court, and who she thought would listen to her story when everyone in Bridgeport had known the Whitfield family before they ever knew her. Marlene's eyes narrowed as she realized Brooklyn would never sign over her father's savings. She slowly slid the transfer papers back into her bag, her voice dropping into a cold, terrifying whisper. "If you won't give us what we need to survive, sweetheart, then you're worth far more to this family gone." Brooklyn looked at Bradley. He was staring down at the water. She asked whether he understood what his mother was saying. He didn't answer. She asked again, calling him by his full name, and he remained silent. Vivian stood several steps away, holding her phone at chest level with the screen pointed toward them. Brooklyn noticed the movement. She'd seen Vivian do it many times inside the house over the past 3 weeks, and each time she'd assumed her sister-in-law was recording something so she could laugh at it later. Brooklyn couldn't think of any other reason now. Corey had moved around behind her. He hadn't said a word all morning, and he said nothing then. Brooklyn heard the wooden boards sink with a soft groan just behind her head. She started to turn. She didn't have time. A hand struck between her shoulder blades with a push that was firm, clean, and deliberate. Not the shove of someone who had lost control, but the measured movement of someone who had already calculated exactly how much force to use. The October water closed over her like a trapdoor. Her chest seized, and every breath inside her was driven out before she could understand what had happened. Her feet couldn't reach the bottom. Something wrapped around her knees, twisting tighter and dragging her downward, and it took her several moments to realize it was the apron she hadn't had time to remove. She kicked. She broke the surface the first time, and what she saw wasn't anyone rushing toward her. All 4 of them were still standing exactly where they had been on the dock. She called her husband's name. She called as loudly as lungs emptied of air could manage. Bradley stepped back half a pace. The water pulled her under again. She didn't know how long she remained beneath the surface. She knew only that the cold no longer felt like cold, but had become something that tightened around her chest and made her arms and legs grow heavier. She kicked once more. She reached the surface a second time, and now she could see them more clearly. Vivian was still holding up her phone, but her hand was trembling, and she wasn't looking at the screen. Corey stood with his arms folded, his expression unchanged. Marlene stared down at the water as though she were watching something that simply needed to be dealt with and finished. Brooklyn called Bradley's name a second time. She managed only his name and couldn't force out another word. And Bradley Whitfield, the man who had promised an 18-year-old girl who had just lost her father that she had a family now, the man whose dinner she had reheated for 9 years without ever asking a question, that man turned his face away. Then she heard Marlene speak. She wasn't speaking to Brooklyn. She was addressing the other three, her voice as calm as though she were bringing a family meeting that had gone on too long to its conclusion. She can't give us children. What does this family gain by keeping her? No one answered. No one stepped toward the edge of the dock. Not one person took off a shoe. Marlene turned away first, and the other three followed her, their footsteps fading across the wooden boards until Brooklyn couldn't hear them anymore. She tried to reach the surface a third time. This time, the water didn't open for her. The apron was still there, wrapped around her legs, and her hands no longer obeyed her. There was one very brief moment, just before consciousness slipped away, when she thought that no one knew she was there. She had driven up alone. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. There was no one in Chicago waiting for her to come home, and her next shift was still 2 days away. That was her final thought that morning. On the dock, the 4 shadows had disappeared into the house, the back door closed, and Lake Geneva sealed itself over the place where she had vanished, smooth and still, as though no one had ever stood there at all. On the opposite shore of Lake Geneva, about a quarter of a mile across the water from that place, a man was swimming. He had gone out onto the lake before dawn had fully broken. The caretaker of the property had been awake since 4 o'clock, had made coffee, left a towel on the steps, then withdrawn inside, because this was something the man did once every year, and the caretaker knew better than to ask questions. Winston Marchetti returned to this place for exactly 1 week each year, always during the first week of October, always alone, and in 10 years, no one had ever heard him explain why. That morning, he swam north before turning back. And as he was nearing the shore on his return, he heard someone call out. Only once. A man's name carried across the water, breaking off halfway through. Winston stopped. He remained in place, treading water and listening. The fog was still thick, the lake a murky white, and he couldn't see anything beyond the ripples directly in front of him. Then the voice called out a second time, far weaker than before, and this time it died away completely before the name was finished. There are people who, upon hearing a cry over the water, will first turn toward shore and look for someone else. Winston Marchetti didn't turn toward shore. He didn't call for anyone, didn't send anyone, didn't reach for the phone in the pocket of the jacket he'd left on the chair. He simply changed direction and swam straight toward the place where the voice had fallen silent. During the first week of October, Lake Geneva was cold enough to make even the strongest person's chest seize after only a few minutes, and Winston had already been in the water for nearly an hour. Still, he swam. He crossed the thickest stretch of fog, reached the place where he calculated the voice had come from, then dived beneath the surface. The first time, he found nothing. He came up for air, fixed his position by the only lamp still glowing on the shore, then went under a second time. Again, there was nothing. On the third dive, his hand touched a piece of fabric drifting beneath the water. He caught hold of it and pulled, and the woman attached to that fabric rose with it. She wasn't moving. Winston wrapped one arm across her chest, held her head back above the surface, and began swimming toward shore with his free arm. He didn't swim toward the wooden dock where she had fallen. He turned the other way and carried her back toward his own shore, even though it was much farther. When he reached shallow water, he lifted her, carried her through the mud and gravel, then laid her on the grass. He turned her onto her side. He pressed down. The first time, nothing happened. The second time, water spilled from her mouth, and she coughed, a dry, ragged sound like wood breaking, before her entire body began shaking from the cold. Winston removed the thing tangled around her legs, the apron soaked through and as heavy as a chain, pulled it free, and threw it aside. Brooklyn's eyes opened slightly. She didn't look at him. She looked toward the opposite shore, toward the dock hidden behind the fog, and her eyelids began to fall. Winston placed a hand against her cheek and turned her face toward him. "Don't close your eyes," he said. "Look at me." His voice wasn't loud. There was no panic in it, no ragged breathing, not a single unnecessary word. It was the voice of a man giving an order without imagining that it might not be obeyed. "You don't owe them this death." Brooklyn opened her eyes. She tried to say something. No sound came out. Her lips moved twice, then stopped. Winston didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask who had done this to her. Didn't ask where she had come from. Didn't ask any of the questions an ordinary person would have asked in such a moment. He looked toward the opposite shore only once, for perhaps 3 seconds, and then he looked away. He took the coat he'd left on the chair and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms and carried her up the slope toward the house. The caretaker stood on the steps, saw him approaching, saw what he was carrying, and opened his mouth to speak. He'd worked there for 11 years and had never once seen his employer bring anything back from the lake. Winston walked past him as though no one were standing there. He laid Brooklyn across the back seat of the car, covered her with another layer, and closed the door very gently. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number. The person on the other end answered after 1 ring. Winston spoke 6 words. "Get the doctor home, right now." Then he ended the call, looked at the caretaker, and pointed toward the small sedan Brooklyn had driven up in. "Have someone move her car back to her apartment lot in Chicago before noon," Winston said quietly. "Leave no trace." Then he climbed into the driver's seat and drove away from the property. Throughout the 90-minute journey back to Chicago, he didn't speak another word, and he didn't turn on any music. Every few minutes, his eyes lifted to the rearview mirror to make sure the chest of the woman lying behind him was still rising and falling. On the opposite shore, inside the vacation house, 4 people were packing their belongings to leave. Bradley glanced out the front window and panicked when he saw Brooklyn's car still parked in the driveway. Marlene didn't flinch. She ordered Corey to drive Brooklyn's car away immediately and abandon it near the highway diner 10 miles south to make it look like she had fled on foot. Not one of them looked out at the water, not even once, and none of them knew that on Lake Geneva that morning, besides the 4 of them, there had been a 5th person. Brooklyn woke on the afternoon of the 3rd day, in a room with a high ceiling and a window overlooking a line of trees in River Forest, though it would be a long time before she learned where she was. An older man stood beside the bed, removing the intravenous line from her hand. He introduced himself as a doctor and told her that her lungs were clear of fluid, that her body temperature had at one point fallen below the danger threshold, and that she had been very fortunate. He didn't ask why she had fallen into the water. He only told her to drink plenty of water, then left the room. Brooklyn was able to sit up on the 4th day. The first thing she did was ask for a phone. The housekeeper brought her one, and she dialed Bradley's number. It rang 3 times, then went silent. She called again. This time, the line went busy before the first ring had finished. She dialed Vivian's number, then Marlene's, and neither of them answered. She set the phone down, and she remained sitting there in silence until night fell. Winston entered the room the following morning. He didn't ask whether she had slept well, and he didn't ask how she was feeling. He pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and placed a neatly clipped stack of papers on the blanket. He told her she ought to read them before calling anyone else. The first page was a copy of the statement the Whitfield family had submitted to the Walworth County Police in Wisconsin, dated October 4th, and recorded at 11:20 in the morning. All 4 of them had given statements identical, down to the last word. They said their daughter-in-law had shown signs of severe depression for months because she couldn't have children. They said she had repeatedly made negative remarks. They said they had taken her to the lake that morning to lift her spirits, that she had walked out onto the dock alone, and that by the time they ran outside, it was already too late. Marlene stated that she had tried to stop her daughter-in-law, but she was 58 years old and could no longer run fast enough. Bradley stated that he didn't know how to swim. Brooklyn reached that line and stopped for a very long time. 9 years earlier, during their honeymoon in Wisconsin Dells, Bradley had swum 2 full laps across the pool in front of her just to show off. She turned to the next page. It was a copy of her medical records from Dr. Peter Lohman's clinic in Chicago, documenting 3 appointments over the course of 2 years, with the final diagnosis printed in bold at the bottom of the page. The family had submitted it with their statements as evidence that she had a motive to take her own life. The very thing that had tormented her for 9 years had now become the reason no one would investigate her death. Winston said nothing while she read. He simply waited, When she set the stack of papers down, he took out the final page and handed it to her. It was a photograph of a life insurance claim submitted to a company in Illinois, with the time of receipt clearly recorded as 10:42 in the morning on October 4th. The person filing the claim was Bradley Whitfield. The beneficiary was Bradley Whitfield. The amount was $500,000, and the insured person was Brooklyn Kowalski Whitfield. She stared at the page for a long time. The policy had been signed on July 14th, 3 months earlier. In the lower corner was a photograph of the signature, and that signature belonged to her. It wasn't a forgery, and it wasn't a tracing. It was unmistakably her handwriting. The signature she had practiced when she was 18 and had to sign the papers to receive her father's death benefit for the first time. She had never seen that insurance policy in her life. Brooklyn didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She merely placed the paper on the blanket and smoothed it flat with her palm twice, very slowly, as though that were the most important thing she could possibly do at that moment. Then she asked a single question. 3 hours, right? Winston nodded. She asked again to be certain, her voice still calm, whether he had filed the claim barely 3 hours after she went under the water. Winston said that was right. Brooklyn turned her face toward the window. Outside, the day had already slipped into afternoon. She thought about how 3 hours was barely enough time for them to pack their bags and submit an electronic claim from their phone on the drive back to Chicago. She thought about how her husband had been sitting there filling out a form while she was still beneath the water, and she realized something she wouldn't be able to put into words until much later. People didn't file a claim that quickly when they had just lost someone. They moved that quickly only when they had already been waiting. Winston rose, gathered the papers, and placed them on the table beside the bed. He told her to rest, that no one would enter the room unless she gave permission, and then he left. That night, Brooklyn lay awake with her eyes open until morning. She didn't think about the lake. She thought about July 14th, trying to remember where she had been that day, what she had signed, and who had been sitting beside her. She couldn't remember, but there was one thing she understood, with perfect clarity. This hadn't begun on the morning of October 4th. To understand why she had been standing on that dock, they would have to go back 9 years. Those 9 years began with 5 o'clock mornings at Pruitt's Diner in Bridgeport. Brooklyn unlocked the doors, turned on the stove, and by 6 o'clock, she'd already been behind the counter for an hour. It was her 6th consecutive double shift that week. Near noon, when the rush had thinned, she pulled an old tin box from beneath the counter and counted her tips. She counted them twice, folded the crisp bills neatly and set them aside, then placed the money in an envelope marked with the date. Dot Pruitt stood at the end of the counter, watching her. She asked how many hours Brooklyn had worked that week. Brooklyn said she couldn't remember. Dot said she remembered, and she told her the number. Then Brooklyn asked for more shifts that weekend. Dot didn't answer right away. She looked down at Brooklyn's feet. The sole of her left shoe had separated at the toe, and Brooklyn had repaired it with black tape, pressing it from the inside so it wouldn't show, though the patch had faded from too many nights spent mopping floors. Dot asked what Brooklyn was saving all that tip money for if she couldn't even buy herself a new pair of shoes. Brooklyn said she didn't spend that money. Dot asked what happened to her wages. Brooklyn said there were things she had to take care of with those. Dot fell silent for a moment, then told her, "You work like someone paying off a debt you never borrowed." Brooklyn laughed, told her not to say things like that, then turned away to get a cloth and wipe the tables. But she paused for half a second before turning, and Dot saw that half second. She gave Brooklyn 2 more weekend shifts, even though the diner needed only 1 person on weekends. The following month, she also left a new pair of shoes on the counter, claiming that a customer had forgotten them, and Brooklyn took them without asking another question. In the evenings, Brooklyn returned to Marlene's house on the south side of Bridgeport. She and Bradley lived in the converted basement, the lowest part of the house, and they'd been there since the 2nd week after their wedding. At first, Marlene said it was only temporary, until Bradley became settled in his job. 9 years later, they were still there. Brooklyn cooked dinner for the entire family every day. When the food was ready, she carried it upstairs, and when everyone sat down at the table, her place was the chair closest to the kitchen, the chair that required whoever sat there to stand every time someone wanted more water or another piece of bread. No one had assigned her that seat. She'd chosen it herself at the first family dinner, and in 9 years, no one had ever told her to sit anywhere else. At the end of each month, the utility bills were placed face up on the kitchen table, and no one said a word. Brooklyn picked them up and paid them. It was the same with Marlene's blood pressure medication and arthritis pills. Once a month, Brooklyn collected them from the pharmacy on her way home from the diner. Vivian once saw her arranging the boxes on the table and remarked on what a thoughtful sister-in-law she was, then went upstairs. No one in that house ever asked how many hours Brooklyn worked each week to pay for all those things. Bradley came home at 11 o'clock almost every night. He didn't explain, and by their 3rd year of marriage, she'd stopped asking. His dinner was still set aside in the oven, and she reheated it whenever she heard the door open. Some nights, she fell asleep at the kitchen table and woke to the sound of his key in the lock. She still got up and warmed his food. When he finished eating, he left his bowl where it was, and she washed it. Someone might ask why a woman in her 20s would accept a life like that, but the answer wasn't found in those 9 years. It lay in everything that had come before. Brooklyn's mother died when she was 12. After that, it was only Brooklyn and her father in a rented apartment, while he worked nights at a machine shop on the west side of the city. When Brooklyn was 18, someone called her school to say that her father hadn't made it out of his shift that night. There was no one but her to arrange the funeral. At 18, Brooklyn signed the papers for his death benefit alone, sitting in a room with 3 strangers in suits across from her. It was the first time in her life that she'd ever had to sign her name on anything important, and she'd practiced the signature on the back of a bill before walking into the room. Bradley Whitfield was 23 then and worked for a building materials company. He met her at the diner where she'd just found a job. He came back every day for 3 straight weeks. He knew her father had recently died, and one evening, after her shift ended, he waited for her outside and told her something she would still remember word for word 9 years later. "You have a family now." A girl of 18 who has just buried her father doesn't need many promises. She needs only one sentence, spoken at exactly the right moment. They married 4 months later at City Hall, with 3 people in attendance. Brooklyn kept Kowalski as part of her full name because she didn't want her father's name to disappear from her documents. Marlene said it was a small thing, that it didn't matter, and she said it in the voice someone might use when allowing a child to keep an old toy. And for the next 9 years, every time Brooklyn did something wrong in that house, whether she forgot to buy salt or came home half an hour late, the first thing Marlene said was always the same. "After all, you were never part of this family to begin with." The questions about a grandchild began in the 4th year. At first, they were only playful remarks made over dinner. Then they became direct questions. Then silence whenever someone in the extended family showed off photographs of a new baby. By the 6th year, Marlene made the appointment herself. She called Dr. Peter Lohman's clinic on the north side of Chicago, put Brooklyn's name on the schedule, and only told her about it that evening. She said it was better to go for peace of mind, and if anything was wrong, they could treat it early. Brooklyn thanked her. The first appointment was on a Tuesday morning, and Marlene went with her. She sat beside Brooklyn in the waiting room, and when the receptionist brought out a stack of papers, Marlene was the one who reached for them. She turned through each page, glanced over them, then placed the stack on Brooklyn's lap and pointed to the final line. "Sign here, sweetheart," she said. "It's only health insurance paperwork." Brooklyn signed. She didn't read it. She'd worked the night shift before. Her eyes were burning, and sitting in front of her was the woman who had given her a roof over her head when she had no one left. People don't carefully read paperwork handed to them by their mother-in-law. She signed where Marlene pointed, handed it back, and Marlene carried the entire stack to the counter. Dr. Lohman was a man in his late 50s with a gentle way of speaking, and he called Brooklyn by her first name from the moment they met. He collected samples and told her to go home and wait. 3 weeks later, the first set of results was inconclusive. He said more testing was needed. The second appointment came 4 months later. Marlene went with her again, took the stack of papers again, pointed to the place where Brooklyn needed to sign again, and repeated the exact same words. Brooklyn signed. This time, Lohman said a few of her levels were concerning, but they needed to keep monitoring them, and he asked her to return in a year. Her mother-in-law remained in the examination room throughout the appointment, asked many questions, and filled a small notebook with notes. On the way home, she held Brooklyn's hand and told her she would stay beside her until the very end. Brooklyn believed her. There was one detail Brooklyn noticed but didn't think much about. During both appointments, Bradley never once entered the doctor's office. The first time, he said he was busy at a construction site. The second time, he drove her there, but remained in the car in the parking lot, saying there was no point in his going inside for women's business. Marlene said all men were like that. The third appointment was on July 14th, 2 years after the second one. Brooklyn remembered the date because the day had been hot, and because she'd traded shifts with a coworker so she could go. Marlene accompanied her as always. In the waiting room, another stack of papers was brought out, thicker than the previous two, and her mother-in-law flipped through it before placing it on her lap. "Sign here, sweetheart," Brooklyn signed. Then Marlene turned several more pages and pointed to another place. "Here too." Brooklyn signed again. She didn't count how many times she signed her name that morning, nor did she look at the title of a single document in that stack. What she remembered more clearly was the anxious feeling in her stomach and how desperately she had prayed that this time the news would be good. Dr. Lohman called her in near noon. He sat down, placed the test results in front of him, and spoke more slowly than he had during the first two appointments. He used the words premature ovarian failure. He said her chances of becoming pregnant naturally were almost non-existent, and that even with medical intervention, the prognosis was very poor. He said he was deeply sorry. Marlene sat beside Brooklyn with one hand resting on her shoulder, and she didn't ask a single question. That was the only strange thing about that morning, that the woman who had filled an entire notebook during the previous two appointments suddenly had nothing to ask. Brooklyn thanked the doctor. She stood, walked into the hallway, and entered the restroom at the far end. She locked the door, turned on the faucet, then sat down and cried. She cried without making a sound, both hands covering her mouth because she was afraid someone outside might hear her. She remained there for about 15 minutes. When she came out, she had washed her face, and she smiled at the receptionist as she passed the front desk. Bradley was waiting in the parking lot. He didn't get out of the car. He'd been sitting there for more than 2 hours. When Brooklyn opened the door and settled into the seat beside him, he asked what the doctor had said. She repeated the doctor's words exactly. Bradley nodded once, started the car, and said nothing else for the entire drive home. Marlene sat in the back seat. In the rearview mirror, Brooklyn saw her staring out the window, her face perfectly calm. That evening, Marlene was the one who announced the news to the entire family over dinner. She said the girl couldn't have children and the doctor had already made his final diagnosis. She spoke in the voice of someone who had just finished reading the results of a soil test. No one looked at Brooklyn. She sat in the chair closest to the kitchen, and twice during that meal, she stood to bring everyone more water. After that evening, Brooklyn tried harder. She took on more shifts, woke earlier, cooked more, and whenever Marlene needed anything, Brooklyn was there before the woman could even call her name. She didn't know any other way to make up for what the doctor had concluded about her. Bradley began coming home later and later. 11 o'clock became midnight, and then there were nights when he didn't come home at all, sending a single message to say he was sleeping at the construction site. She didn't ask questions. Then, on a Thursday in the middle of September, Pruitt's diner was quiet during the mid-morning lull, and Dot told her to leave 2 hours early. Brooklyn didn't go home. She stopped at the market for groceries, prepared a boxed lunch, then drove to the office of the building materials company where her husband worked. She had never brought lunch to his workplace before. She thought perhaps it was something a wife ought to do more often. She parked near the entrance to the lot, stepped out carrying the lunch, and saw Bradley's pickup truck parked in the second row. There were 2 people inside. He was in the driver's seat. Beside him was a woman Brooklyn had never seen before. They weren't doing anything. They were only talking, and Bradley was laughing, the kind of laugh Brooklyn hadn't seen on his face in years. The woman raised a hand and straightened his collar. That was all. But there are gestures people make only with someone they've known intimately for a very long time, and Brooklyn stood at the edge of that parking lot long enough to understand. She didn't approach them. She didn't knock on the truck window, call anyone's name, or do any of the things a woman in her position had every right to do. She returned to her car, set the lunch on the seat beside her, and sat there without moving for nearly 10 minutes. The container was still warm. She had gotten up earlier than usual to prepare it, and all the way there, she had been thinking about what she would say when she walked into her husband's office for the first time. Now she couldn't think of anything at all. Then she drove home. She cooked dinner as she always did. She left Bradley's portion in the oven. She washed the dishes, wiped down the stove, and sat at the kitchen table to wait. He came home at 11:20. Brooklyn reheated his dinner, set it on the table, then sat across from him. She asked what the woman's name was. Bradley's chopsticks stopped. He didn't ask who she was talking about. He didn't deny it, make an excuse, or pretend to be surprised. He merely sat in silence for several seconds, then told her the woman's name. Sloan Rivers. He said she worked in the accounting department of one of their suppliers, and that they had known each other for more than a year. He gave that length of time with perfect calm, as though it were the least important detail in the story. Brooklyn asked whether he had ever intended to tell her. Bradley said he had meant to, many times, but had never found the right moment. She asked if there hadn't been a single right moment in more than a year. He didn't answer that question. Then, he set down his chopsticks and spoke the words that, 9 years later, when everything was over, she would remember more clearly than the sound of the water closing above her head. He said he needed someone who could give him a child. He said it wasn't anyone's fault, Brooklyn. He said it was simply the truth. He spoke in the voice of a man explaining a technical problem, without any cruelty in it, and that was precisely what made it crueler than any insult could have been. Brooklyn remained silent for a very long time. Not a single argument came to her mind. She didn't think about how he had hidden this from her for more than a year. She didn't think about how he had sat in the clinic parking lot for 2 hours on the day she received her diagnosis. She thought only of what the doctor had said and what her mother-in-law had announced at the dinner table. Then she did the thing that would make it harder for her to breathe every time she remembered it. Harder even than when she had been beneath the lake. She apologized to him. She said, "I'm sorry." She said she knew this was because of her, that she had tried, and that she would see another doctor if he wanted her to. She said she would find a way. Bradley didn't answer. He finished the dinner she had just reheated for him, left his bowl on the table, then went downstairs to the basement to sleep. Brooklyn washed that bowl. She stood at the sink with the water running and remained there long after it was clean. No one in the house ever mentioned what had happened. Bradley still came home at 11 o'clock. Brooklyn still reheated his dinner, and they both behaved as though that conversation had never taken place. But something had changed. From that day forward, whenever Marlene looked at Brooklyn across the dinner table, it was no longer the gaze of a mother-in-law looking at a daughter-in-law who had failed to give her a grandchild. It was the gaze of someone calculating whether an object in her house could still be useful for anything at all. That summer, Bradley's company began falling behind on payroll. He said it was because clients owed them money. Then he said the bank had tightened their credit limit, and then he stopped saying anything at all. Some evenings, the entire family sat through dinner without anyone speaking, and Brooklyn understood that the situation was far worse than what she had been told. At the end of September, Marlene called her into the living room. She made tea, told Brooklyn to sit down, and spoke very gently. She reminded her of how this family had treated her over the past 9 years. She mentioned the basement, the meals, and how she had regarded Brooklyn as a daughter. Brooklyn listened and nodded. Then Marlene began talking about money. She said she knew Brooklyn had savings. Brooklyn asked how she knew. Marlene said that wasn't important. It was only later that Brooklyn realized there was exactly one person in that house who had ever seen her bank records, and that person was her husband. Marlene said Bradley's company needed enough money to repay the bank within the next 6 weeks, or they would lose everything. Then she named the amount, $180,000. All of it. Brooklyn asked again to make certain she had heard correctly, and Marlene repeated the figure without blinking. She said it would save the entire family, that the company would repay her once it recovered, and that members of a family didn't keep accounts with one another. Brooklyn said no. She said it very softly, and the answer surprised even her. In 9 years, she had never refused that woman anything. She said that $90,000 of it had come from her father, that she had never spent a single cent, and that it was the only thing she had left of him. She said she had saved the rest, so that if anything ever happened, she would have something to fall back on. She said she would lend them a smaller portion, that she would do everything she could, but she wouldn't give them all of it. Marlene set down her teacup. She didn't shout. She said Brooklyn had come into that house with empty hands and a battered suitcase. She said this family had given her a name. Then she fell silent and looked at her, and Brooklyn realized that the woman sitting before her wasn't angry at all. She was merely waiting to see whether Brooklyn would change her mind. She didn't. Marlene rose, gathered the teapot and cups, and said that was fine. She would find another way. Over the next 3 weeks, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. No one raised their voice at Brooklyn. No one threw her out of the basement. But whenever she walked into the kitchen, the conversation stopped in the middle of a sentence. And as soon as she left, it resumed. She still cooked the meals, and everyone still ate them, but no one thanked her anymore, not even with the careless sort of thanks they had once offered. Corey began visiting often. Before then, he had come only for holidays, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year. During those 3 weeks, he appeared almost every other day, sitting with Marlene in the living room for hours, and several times, Brooklyn came home to find the living room door closed. He greeted her very politely whenever they met. He even asked whether work had been tiring lately. Her husband hadn't asked her that question once in 9 years, and that was why Brooklyn remembered it. Vivian, meanwhile, began carrying her phone everywhere. She held it in her hand at all times, and whenever Brooklyn entered the room, Vivian raised it to chest level without speaking, her eyes never looking at the screen. Once, Brooklyn asked what she was doing. Vivian said it was nothing, then put the phone away. Brooklyn thought her sister-in-law was secretly recording her so she would have something to laugh about with other people later. That was what she believed, and she let it go, because in 9 years she had learned to let many things go. At the end of the 3rd week, Marlene called her in the middle of her morning shift. Her voice was warm again, as though nothing had ever happened. She said it had been far too long since the family had gone anywhere together. She said she had rented a lake house on Lake Geneva for the weekend, that the whole family would go, and that it was time for everyone to sit down, talk things through properly, and put the past behind them. Brooklyn stood behind the diner counter with a cleaning cloth still in her hand, and she heard herself say that yes, she would go. She asked Dot to change her shift. Dot asked whether she was certain, and Brooklyn said that, after all, they were the only family she had. She worked the Friday night shift to make up for it. And on Saturday morning, as soon as her shift ended, she drove straight to the lake. She had believed they were inviting her there to make peace. 2 months after that morning, in the mansion in River Forest, Brooklyn sat on the edge of the bed with a copy of the insurance policy in her hands. She had read it no fewer than 30 times. She turned to the page bearing her signature and stared at it for a long time. And this time, she noticed something she had missed before. The handwriting leaned slightly to the right, and the final letter trembled faintly. She signed that way only when her hand wasn't steady. Then she looked down at the date printed in the upper corner, July 14th. She remained completely still for a very long time. Then she rose, opened the bedroom door, and went to find the man who had pulled her out of the water. But the conversation that decided everything had taken place long before that, on the 6th day after she was pulled from the lake. By then, Brooklyn could walk again. She told Winston she wanted to return to Chicago, that she wanted to go to the police station, and that she would tell them everything. He listened until she finished. Then he asked whom she intended to tell, and who would believe her. He reminded her of everything she had read in the file. 4 people had given identical statements. A medical record showed that she had a reason to take her own life, and she was only a diner waitress, with no parents, no siblings, and no one who could stand up and verify a single word she said. He told her that if she went home that morning, the entire Whitfield family would know by noon. Then he gave her 2 choices, speaking in the voice of a man reading the weather forecast. The first choice was to go home. They would cry, they would embrace her, and they would say it had all been a terrible misunderstanding. Then, sometime within the next 6 months, she would fall down a flight of stairs, take the wrong medication, or fall asleep in a room with the gas stove burning. No one would investigate, because the record of her depression was already there waiting. The second choice was to remain silent. Let them continue believing it was over. And while they believed that, she would have time. Brooklyn asked what he wanted. She asked directly, without circling around the question, because she had spent 9 years living with people who always gave first and demanded payment later. Winston said he wanted nothing. She didn't believe him. She told him so. She said that in 27 years, no one had ever given her anything without taking something else in return. That she had even paid for a place to sleep, with 9 years of cooking meals and settling bills. She told him to say it now. She wanted to know the price in advance. Winston didn't argue. He made no promises and offered no further explanation. He only told her to wait and see, then rose and walked out. That night, Brooklyn lay awake thinking about those 2 choices, and near dawn, she realized that there had only ever been one, because she no longer had anywhere to go home to. 3 days later, the story appeared in a local Wisconsin newspaper. A 27-year-old woman had disappeared on Lake Geneva on the morning of October 4th. Her family had reported her missing, and search teams had worked for 2 days. Then a shorter report appeared at the end of the week, only 3 lines long, saying the case had been closed and there was no indication of a crime. Brooklyn read it on her phone while sitting on the edge of the bed, and she read those same 3 lines 7 times. The funeral was held 10 days later in Bridgeport. A local television station came to film it, because a story about a daughter-in-law drowning before the eyes of her husband's entire family was the kind of news people liked to watch over dinner. Brooklyn watched the report on her phone the following night. Marlene stood before the camera dressed in black, and she cried. She said the girl had been the daughter she had never had. She said she would never forgive herself for not running faster. Her tears were real. They streamed all the way down to her chin, and the reporter had to pause and wait for her to regain her composure. The broadcast ended there, but the cameraman hadn't turned off the camera immediately. 9 additional seconds remained in the original footage posted on the station's website, and during those 9 seconds, Marlene turned away and walked toward the car, and her face was dry before she opened the door. She didn't wipe it. The grief simply switched off in exactly 1 second, the way someone turned off a faucet. Brooklyn replayed that moment 4 times. She had lived beneath that woman's roof for 9 years, and not once had she realized she was watching an actress. Then she locked her phone, placed it face down, and didn't turn it on again for the next 3 days. That evening, downstairs in the mansion, Enzo Barone stood across from Winston and spoke more loudly than he ordinarily did. Enzo had been beside this family for 30 years. He had sat beside Winston's father before he ever sat beside Winston, and he was the only man in the house permitted to speak plainly. He said she was a civilian. He said that for 30 years, they hadn't involved civilians, hadn't brought them into the house, and hadn't allowed their names to appear beside their own in any record. He said there was now a woman who had been legally declared dead in Wisconsin, sleeping upstairs, and if anyone ever wanted a way to strike at Winston Marchetti, they wouldn't need to look for anything else. He said there was no benefit in this at all. Not a dollar, not a connection, not a single thing. He asked why. Winston didn't interrupt him once. When Enzo had finished, Winston poured himself a glass of water, took a sip, then set it down. He said he had stood on that lake shore once before and gone home empty-handed. He said there wouldn't be a second time. Brooklyn heard those words. She was standing on the stair landing, not deliberately eavesdropping. She had only come downstairs for water and happened to stop at that exact moment. She didn't understand what Winston was talking about, but that sentence about the lake shore remained in her mind for days afterward, and every time she thought of it, something else surfaced alongside it, something she couldn't name, like looking at a familiar face and being unable to remember where you had seen it before. On the 4th night, she remembered. She was washing a glass at the sink in the mansion's kitchen, and it was the sound of the water that brought the memory back. March of the previous year. 2 o'clock in the morning. Pruitt stayed open all night on weekends, and Brooklyn took the night shift because it paid an extra $1.50 an hour. It was raining that night, and there were only 3 customers in the diner. A man walked in, sat on the stool at the far end of the counter, and ordered nothing. Brooklyn brought him a menu. He thanked her but didn't open it. She poured him a glass of water, and he thanked her again. Then he simply sat there. 15 minutes. Half an hour. 45 minutes. He didn't look at his phone or toward the door. He only sat with his back straight, staring at the counter in front of him, his hands folded one over the other. The night cook leaned his head out of the kitchen and asked whether she needed him to call someone. Brooklyn said no. She had stood behind that counter for 8 years, and she knew the difference between a man who was drunk, a man waiting to start trouble, and a man who simply didn't want to go home. After about an hour, she made him a plate of eggs and toast. She didn't ask whether he wanted anything to eat, because she knew he would say no. She merely carried it over, placed it before him with a knife and fork, and said the kitchen had accidentally made an extra plate and he could help her finish it so it wouldn't go to waste. Then she went to wipe down the tables on the other side of the diner. When she returned, the plate was clean. The man stood and put on his coat, then laid a $500 bill on the counter. Brooklyn looked at the money, then at him. She said the meal cost $7.25, and if he wanted to pay, she would put it on a check. He told her to keep it. She pushed the bill back toward him and said everyone paid the same price there, sir. She said the meal was on her. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the bill, folded it, slipped it into his pocket, thanked her, and walked out. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. At the door, he stopped for half a second, turned his head to look back at the counter once, then left. By the following morning, Brooklyn had forgotten the encounter, the way people forget most of what happens during a night shift. Brooklyn stood at the sink with the glass in her hand and the water still running. Then she went to find Winston. He was sitting in his study. She asked him directly whether it had been him. The diner in Bridgeport. March of last year. 2 o'clock in the morning. Winston didn't look surprised. He set down his pen and said yes. Brooklyn asked why he had been sitting alone in a diner in Bridgeport at 2 o'clock in the morning without ordering anything. Winston remained silent for quite some time. Then he gave her a name, Gianna Marchetti, his younger sister. She was 22. 10 years earlier, during the first week of October, she had gone to Lake Geneva with several friends, and she had never come back up. Winston told the story without a single unnecessary word. He didn't name the friends or say what they had done or failed to do. He said he had been in Chicago when the call came. He said he had made the 90-minute drive in 79 minutes. Then he gave her the final number, speaking in the voice of a man who had counted it over and over for 10 years. 11 minutes. He had arrived 11 minutes too late. Brooklyn asked what March had to do with it. Winston said Gianna's birthday had been in March. He said that every year on her birthday, he drove aimlessly through the city until dawn. And that night, he had stopped at the first diner he saw with its lights still on. He said that throughout that entire night, no one had asked who he was. No one had wanted anything from him. And one woman had served him a plate of food and lied that the kitchen had made an extra one. He said that in 15 years, no one had ever pushed his money back toward him. Brooklyn sat down in the chair across from him. She asked if that was why he had jumped into the lake. Winston didn't answer. He looked out the window for a while, then said that for 10 years he had stood on that lake shore and watched the water that had taken someone from him. He said that this year it had given someone back. He said he had no intention of asking why. Brooklyn couldn't speak. She sat there in silence, thinking about that night in March, about a plate of eggs that had cost $7.25, about how she had made it only because she had seen a man sitting too long without eating. She had forgotten about it within a day, and 9 months later, that forgotten night was the only thing standing between her and the bottom of Lake Geneva. The next morning, Brooklyn told Winston that she wanted to know what had happened to her. She said she wasn't planning to take revenge on anyone. She said she had lain awake thinking all night, and the only thing she wanted was to understand why, because she had lived in that house for 9 years and couldn't accept that she had failed to see any of it. Winston listened until she finished. He didn't advise her what to do. He didn't tell her she should forget it, and he didn't tell her she should pursue it to the end. He merely wrote a name on a piece of paper and slid it toward her. Ellis Ward. Beneath it was a phone number. He said this man had spent 19 years investigating financial crimes for a federal agency, and now worked privately, and that if she called, she should simply give him her name without mentioning Winston's. Then he returned to his work. Brooklyn took the piece of paper back to her room and sat looking at it all afternoon. She called at 4 o'clock. Ellis Ward arrived 2 days later. He was a thin man with silver hair, carrying a briefcase and an old laptop. He didn't ask what she had been through. His first question was whether she had managed to keep any documents, and his second was whether she remembered any specific dates. Brooklyn gave him the file Winston had given her. Ellis read for 40 minutes without saying a word. Then he returned to the insurance policy, placed one finger on the upper right corner, and asked where she had been on July 14th of the previous year. Brooklyn said she had been at Dr. Lohman's clinic. Ellis said nothing more. He opened his computer, typed a few lines, made 2 brief phone calls, and returned 3 days later with another stack of papers. It was the complete file the insurance company had in its possession. Ellis placed it on the table, opened it to a page he had already marked, and told her to look carefully. The life insurance policy was 21 pages long. Brooklyn's signature was on page 14. Then Ellis opened the second file, the clinic's medical records from that same July 14th. He showed her the order in which the pages had been scanned into the system. Consent for testing, consent for treatment, then 3 pages that didn't belong to the clinic. Then the consent form authorizing the use of medical information. Ellis said those 3 pages had been slipped into the middle of the stack, and the entire stack had been handed to her to sign all at once in the waiting room before she saw the doctor. Brooklyn sat staring at those papers for a very long time. She remembered the waiting room. She remembered Marlene turning each page and laying it across her lap. She remembered signing 3 or 4 times without reading a single line, because Marlene had said they were health insurance forms, because Brooklyn had worked through the entire previous night, and because this was her mother-in-law. Then she remembered what she had noticed while sitting on the edge of the bed a few days earlier, that the final letter of her signature trembled slightly. She asked Ellis one question. She asked whether those 3 pages had been near the beginning of the stack or the end. Ellis said they had been at the end. Brooklyn nodded. Now she understood. She had signed the first few pages in the waiting room while her mind was still clear. She had signed the last ones after coming out of the doctor's office, when Marlene stopped her in the hallway and said there were still a few places she had missed. Brooklyn had just heard that her chances were almost non-existent. She had just spent 15 minutes in the restroom at the end of the hall. Her hand had been trembling, her eyes were swollen, and she had signed wherever Marlene pointed without looking, exactly as she always did. Brooklyn rested her hand on the document and said nothing for a very long time. Then she spoke one sentence aloud. "So I really did sign it myself." Ellis said yes. He added that it was her genuine signature, not a forgery, and legally, that was the most difficult thing to overcome. But then he turned to the final page and said they had made one mistake. He pointed to 2 dates. The policy had been signed on July 14th. The claim had been filed on October 4th. He said that was less than 3 months. He said no insurance company anywhere in America would pay out $500,000 on a policy that had been in effect for less than 3 months without opening an investigation. He said it was standard procedure in every case and required no accusation from anyone. He said that if they had known enough to wait 2 years, perhaps no one would ever have asked any questions, but they hadn't been able to wait even 40 minutes. Brooklyn sat in silence. She thought about how the thing that had killed her was a signature she had written with her own hand, and the thing saving her now was the impatience of the very people who had stood on that dock. She asked Ellis where they should begin. Ellis closed his laptop and said they would begin with the doctor. It took Ellis Ward 11 days. Dr. Lohman's clinic had changed its record storage system 3 years earlier, and the scan in the computer showed only the final version. But every clinic had employees who left, and some people left because they had seen something they never wanted to see. Ellis found a nurse who had quit working there in the spring of the previous year. She didn't ask for money. She asked only one question: whether the woman in that file was still alive. And when Ellis said she was, the nurse went to retrieve an envelope she had kept in a cabinet for 18 months. Ellis brought it back on Thursday afternoon. He didn't explain anything beforehand. He simply placed 2 sheets of paper on the table in front of Brooklyn, side by side, and told her to read them. The sheet on the left was her original test result, dated July 14th. Beneath the conclusion was a single line: all values within normal limits, no abnormalities detected. Brooklyn read that line 3 times. Then she looked at the sheet on the right. It was a test result bearing Bradley Whitfield's name, performed at the same clinic and dated 2 years earlier. The conclusion stated that no sperm had been found in the sample, and beneath it was a handwritten note from Dr. Lohman recommending that the patient return for counseling. There was no record of any follow-up appointment. Brooklyn studied the date on that sheet and realized it fell during the period when her husband had told her he was undergoing a routine medical examination for his company. Ellis placed a bank statement on the table next: $25,000, transferred from Marlene Whitfield's personal account to a medical consulting company whose sole owner was Peter Lohman, 9 days after the date on the test result to the right. Ellis said only that the 2 files had been switched, and from that moment onward, everything entered into Brooklyn's medical record had been written to match the conclusion already in place. Brooklyn said nothing. She sat there for a very long time, both hands resting on the table, her eyes lowered toward the 2 sheets of paper. She thought about the 3 doctor's appointments. She thought about the dinner when Marlene had announced the news to the entire family, in the same voice someone might use to read a soil test report. She thought about the night she had sat across from her husband at the kitchen table and apologized to him. She thought about the 9 years she had spent sitting in the chair closest to the kitchen because she believed she had to make up for the one thing she couldn't give them. Then she spoke, very softly, almost to herself. "So there was never anything wrong with me." Then she said, "All those years there was never anything wrong with me." Ellis didn't answer. He gathered the papers into his briefcase, said he would leave all the copies with her, then went home. That evening, Brooklyn went downstairs to find Winston. She placed the file on his desk and told him she wanted him to handle it. She said he could do it in a single night, that she knew he could, and that she wouldn't ask how he had done it. Winston looked at the file. He didn't pick it up. He said that if he did this for her, she would still be a woman allowing someone else to decide the course of her life. She would merely be changing masters. Then he pushed the file back toward her and said her hands were her own. Brooklyn stood there for a moment. She was about to say something, but she didn't. She picked up the file and went upstairs. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the bed, with the 2 test results lying side by side on the blanket, and she thought that if Winston had agreed, she would have nothing left to do by morning. And once again, she would be the person sitting and waiting for someone else to decide. The next morning, she went down to the kitchen shortly before 6 o'clock, and someone was already there. Rosa Marchetti, Winston's mother, was dividing dough into portions on the table. She saw Brooklyn standing in the doorway, but she didn't ask whether she had slept well or whether she was all right. She merely tilted her head toward the chair beside her and told Brooklyn to come over. Then she pushed a portion of dough across the table. Brooklyn sat down and began kneading it. The two women worked in silence for about 20 minutes. Rosa didn't ask about Lake Geneva. She didn't ask about the Whitfield house. She didn't ask what Brooklyn intended to do next. She corrected Brooklyn's hands only once, telling her not to press so hard. When the dough was finished, Brooklyn rose to wash her hands, then moved backward toward the door and stopped at the threshold, in the exact place where she had stood for weeks, whenever someone else was in the room. Rosa looked up at her. She told Brooklyn not to stand in doorways anymore. She said that in this house, Brooklyn didn't have to fight for a seat. Her seat was already there. Then Rosa turned back to her dough as though she had merely commented on the weather. Brooklyn remained at the threshold for another few seconds. Then she sat down again, and she cried. She cried for the first time since she had been pulled from the water, silently, with both flour-covered hands resting on the table, and she didn't raise them to hide her face. Rosa said nothing. She simply continued kneading her dough, and every so often, she pushed the towel toward Brooklyn. Brooklyn made the appointment under her real name. She called the clinic on Monday morning, said she was a former patient, and the receptionist repeated her name once before falling silent for quite a while, then scheduled her for the final appointment on Wednesday afternoon. She went alone. Winston didn't ask whether she needed anyone to accompany her, and she didn't ask him to. That morning, he merely watched her carry the document folder toward the door without saying a word. She drove herself, parked in the lot, and took only one folder inside. It contained 2 test results and 1 bank statement. Peter Lohman rose when she entered his office. He didn't greet her. His face had gone pale the moment she opened the door, because he had seen her name on the schedule since Monday morning, and had been given nearly 3 days to think about why a woman legally declared dead in Wisconsin had made an appointment at his clinic. Brooklyn sat in the patient's chair, the same chair she had occupied during her previous 3 visits. She said nothing about the lake. She opened the folder, removed the 3 sheets of paper, placed them on the desk before him, turned them so they faced the right way, then pushed them across. She told him to read them. Lohman didn't need to. He looked at the 3rd page, the bank statement, then sat down. Brooklyn said she hadn't come to ask why. She already knew why. She said she had come to give him 2 choices, and she spoke in the same calm voice she had heard someone use with her not long before. The first choice was for him to write a full statement himself, confessing everything to the Illinois Medical Board, and submit it before she left that room. The second choice was for him to do nothing, in which case those 3 documents would be submitted to the board along with her civil lawsuit, and he would no longer be the one taking the initiative. When she finished, she sat in silence. She didn't add another word of threat. She didn't mention any name but his. Lohman sat there for 4 minutes. He tried once. He said the situation was more complicated than she understood, that Mrs. Whitfield had come to him under very difficult circumstances, and that he had been struggling financially at the time. Brooklyn didn't interrupt him. She merely waited until he had finished, then asked again which one he chose. Lohman sagged in his chair. Then he did something Brooklyn hadn't expected. He opened a desk drawer, took out an old cell phone, unlocked it, and pushed it toward her. It contained every text message exchanged between him and Marlene Whitfield over the course of 2 years. He said he had kept them from the beginning. He said he had saved them because he knew that if the truth ever came out, he would be the first person they pushed forward to take the blame. Brooklyn picked up the phone. She read the first few messages. One of them was from Marlene, sent on the evening before Brooklyn's 3rd appointment, asking whether there was any way to make the conclusion sound more definitive. Brooklyn stopped reading there, because there are some things a person doesn't need to finish reading in order to understand. She stood, returned the 3 documents to the folder, and left the office. Peter Lohman's statement was submitted that night. Then everything began to collapse, faster than Brooklyn had imagined, without a single phone call from Winston Marchetti. The insurance company had already opened an investigation in October, and now it had even more reason to keep the claim frozen, leaving the request for the $500,000 payout suspended indefinitely. While reviewing Bradley's loan records, His bank discovered that the revenue reported in his financial statements for the previous 2 years didn't match the company's actual cash flow. The building materials company was out of business within 6 weeks. Corey Whitfield's finance truck was repossessed, and his professional license was suspended after another loan surfaced during the same review. Marlene's reverse mortgage on the Bridgeport house was called in because parts of her asset declaration were inaccurate, something no one discovered until her name appeared in a doctor's written confession. Within 9 weeks, the family who had once sat around the dining table while Brooklyn rose to pour water for every one of them had lost the company, the truck, and the license, and was about to lose the house as well. Brooklyn wasn't present for any of it. She sat in River Forest and read each brief update Ellis Ward sent her. She felt no pleasure. She felt no regret either. She noticed only one thing. She hadn't needed to raise a hand against anyone. All she had done was carry 3 sheets of paper to the right place and set them down. And she thought about how, for 9 years, simply because she hadn't read the papers people placed before her, they had been able to rewrite her life from beginning to end. During that review, Ellis Ward sent Brooklyn the complete financial records of every member of the Whitfield family. She read all of them. Vivian's file was the thinnest, and Brooklyn had nearly passed over it until she noticed a debt unlike all the others. It wasn't credit card debt. It wasn't a car loan. It was an overdue medical bill from a children's hospital in Chicago, listed under Vivian Whitfield's name, with Hazel Whitfield, 8 years old, named as the patient. Brooklyn sat staring at that name for a long time. She remembered the little girl. Hazel was the only person in that house who called her Aunt Brooklyn, and whenever the family sat down to dinner, she was the only one who ever asked why Aunt Brooklyn had to keep getting up. Ellis spent another 2 days looking into it for her. Hazel had a narrowed heart valve that doctors had been monitoring since she was 6, and surgery had been recommended in the spring. Vivian had postponed it 3 times. The first time was because the insurance wouldn't cover the entire balance. The second was because she hadn't managed to raise enough for the copay. The third was the previous month, after everything in the Whitfield household collapsed at once. Brooklyn asked Ellis how much was still missing. He gave her the number, and it was an amount she'd once had more than enough of in her own bank account 9 years earlier. She sat in silence for nearly an hour. She thought about the woman who had stood on the dock and raised her phone. She thought that she didn't owe that woman anything, and that if anyone in that house deserved to watch her child wait for surgery, it was the woman who had stood there, watching Brooklyn sink. She thought that for a long time, and she couldn't see anything wrong with it. Then she thought about the 8-year-old girl in that file, and she realized that the child had never done anything at all. The next morning, Brooklyn called Ellis and asked him to find a children's medical assistance fund in Illinois, one that accepted designated donations and kept the donor's identity confidential. He found 3. She chose one, transferred the entire amount still needed, and signed a request to keep her identity private. They asked whether she wanted to leave a message for the patient's family. She said no. Hazel's surgery was rescheduled for 11 days later. Brooklyn learned the outcome through a brief message Ellis sent her that evening, saying the operation was over and the little girl was all right. She read the message twice, turned off her phone, and told no one. She didn't tell Ellis why she had done it. She didn't tell Winston. She didn't even tell herself she had done something kind. She thought only one thing, that the little girl hadn't been standing on the dock that day. And then she went to sleep. A few evenings later, Winston asked what she planned to do next. He asked casually while the 2 of them were sitting in the dining room after dinner. Brooklyn said she didn't know. Then she added something she hadn't intended to say. She told him she couldn't understand him, that 3 months had passed and he still hadn't asked her for anything, and that frightened her more than it would have if he had. Winston didn't answer immediately. She continued. She said that when she was 18, someone had promised her a family, and she had lost 9 years of her life. She said a woman had called her daughter, and Brooklyn had nearly lost her life. She said that every time she trusted someone, she lost something, and now that she had nothing left to lose, she didn't know what she would lose this time. She told him she didn't know how to trust anyone, and she apologized for that. Winston set down his glass. He looked at her for a moment, then said he didn't need her to trust him. He needed her to live. Then he stood and walked away without another word, without touching her, without making a single promise. Brooklyn remained alone at the dining table. She had already prepared several answers in her mind for when he tried to comfort her, but he hadn't comforted her, and she had no use for any of them. That was the first night since October that she slept straight through until morning. But something was happening on the other side of the city that Brooklyn wouldn't learn about until much later. 2 years earlier, when the building materials company began running short of capital and the bank rejected Bradley Whitfield for the second time, he had borrowed $400,000 through a man named Ruben Castellano. The money didn't belong to Castellano. It belonged to Milos Kovac. Bradley hadn't paid a single dollar of interest in the previous 8 months, and when the company closed, Kovac understood that the money was gone. Then someone told him that Bradley Whitfield's dead wife was now living in a house in River Forest. Kovac summoned Bradley. He didn't ask for the money anymore. He said there was a way to erase the entire $400,000 debt, and all Bradley had to do was get his wife out of that house once, to a place of Kovac's choosing. Bradley Whitfield asked only one question, whether erased truly meant erased. Then he agreed. It was the second time he had sold his wife, and this time there was an actual price. In early January, Marlene Whitfield held a memorial service at a church in Bridgeport to mark the 3rd month since her daughter-in-law's death. Ellis Ward understood its purpose immediately. The insurance claim was still frozen, and the only way to pressure an insurance company was to turn the case into a story that would win public sympathy. She invited the entire neighborhood. She called the same television station that had filmed the story in October. Brooklyn knew the date and time in advance. She sat in her room for a long while that morning, then opened the closet and took out the waitress uniform that had been washed and folded away since October. She put it on. It was the only thing in her life the Whitfields had never touched, because it belonged to her, because she had earned it herself, and because she had been wearing it that morning. She drove to Bridgeport alone. She entered the church when the service was already halfway over, just as Marlene stood at the pulpit speaking about the daughter she'd never had. Brooklyn didn't walk to the front. She merely stood at the end of the center aisle, and she remained there until the first person turned around. Then the second row turned. Then the entire church turned. Marlene saw her last. She was holding a glass of water at the pulpit, and she dropped it to the floor. Bradley was sitting in the front row. He tried to stand, bracing one hand against the back of the pew ahead of him, then collapsed into his seat and couldn't rise again. The television cameraman swung his lens toward the back of the church. Brooklyn walked slowly up the center aisle, and when she reached the pulpit, she stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke just loudly enough for the front row to hear, and the microphone at the pulpit caught every word. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mom," she said. "The lake was deeper than you thought." Then she turned and walked out. She didn't look back once, and she didn't speak another word to anyone in that church. The video was posted on the station's news site that afternoon. By evening, the Walworth County Police had reopened the case because a woman officially reported as having drowned had just walked into a church under her own power in front of a television camera. 3 weeks later, Bradley began telling everyone that Sloane Rivers was pregnant. He told relatives. He told neighbors. He even told a reporter who called seeking comment. He repeated the same point over and over, that he was about to become a father, and now everyone could see who had been responsible for those 9 childless years. It was the only thing he had left to hold on to, and he gripped it tightly. Brooklyn didn't contradict him once. She posted nothing, called no one, and didn't ask Ellis to release anything to the press. She sent only one message to Sloane Rivers, asking for 15 minutes of her time. They met at a cafe on Halsted Street. Sloane arrived 20 minutes late and sat down with the expression of someone who had prepared herself to be scolded. Brooklyn didn't scold her. She pushed an envelope across the table. Sloane asked what was inside. Brooklyn said it was Bradley Whitfield's original test result, completed more than 2 years earlier at Dr. Peter Lohman's clinic. She said she hadn't come to offer advice, and she hadn't come to take anything back. Whether Sloane read it was entirely up to her. Then Brooklyn said one last thing. "I lost 9 years of my life because I didn't read one piece of paper." She stood, paid for both coffees, and left. Sloane Rivers remained alone in the cafe for about 40 minutes, and she opened the envelope before leaving her seat. That evening, she carried it to Marlene's house. Brooklyn learned what happened afterward only through other people. Sloane didn't confront Bradley about the document in private. She questioned him in the living room while the entire family was present. She asked how long he had known. Bradley couldn't answer. He tried to say the result was wrong, that the clinic had already been investigated and therefore nothing from it could be trusted. But Sloane was no longer listening, because while he spoke, she had realized something else, and that other realization was what tore the house apart. If Bradley couldn't father a child, then the baby inside her belonged to the other man. She said his name aloud in the middle of the living room. Corey Whitfield, her husband's brother, the man who had stood behind Brooklyn on the dock on the morning of October 4th, and the same man Marlene had promised to share once the $500,000 came through. Bradley lunged at Corey. Marlene threw herself between them. Vivian screamed. There was the sound of a glass shattering, then something ceramic crashing to the floor, then the front door slamming shut. Within an hour, the family who had once sat around a dining table and composed statements identical down to the last word had stopped speaking to one another entirely. Corey left that night. Sloane never returned, and Marlene Whitfield remained alone in the house she was about to lose, surrounded by broken pieces on the floor, with a sworn statement that would now collapse completely if just one of the 4 people withdrew their testimony. Brooklyn returned to work at Pruitt's in the middle of February. Dot gave her the morning shift and didn't ask a single question about the previous 3 months. During her second week back, a man entered the diner shortly before noon, took the last stool at the counter, ordered coffee, then placed his badge on the countertop. Curtis Nolan, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Brooklyn assumed he had come because of the Whitfields. Nolan said he hadn't. He said he'd been following one name for 11 years, and that name wasn't Whitfield. Then he asked her a question. Had she ever wondered why a man like Winston Marchetti would spend 3 months on a diner waitress? Brooklyn didn't answer. Nolan asked whether she thought Winston had saved her. Men like that didn't save anyone, he said. Men like that invested. Then he laid out what he had brought her. If she cooperated and gave a full account of everything she had seen and heard inside the River Forest house, the federal government would move the Whitfield case into the most serious category of prosecution available, and she would be given a new identity in another state. He told her it was an opportunity a great many people would want. Brooklyn said she needed time. It took her 3 nights. On the first night, she thought about how she had never seen Winston commit a crime, but she wasn't naive, and there were things inside that house she had deliberately chosen not to ask about. On the second night, she thought about 27 years in which no one had ever given her anything for free. On the third night, she sat down and counted again. 3 months in River Forest. A name written on a scrap of paper. A file laid on a blanket. A man telling her that her hands belonged to her. And not once, not one single time, had anyone named a price. The next morning, she called Nolan. They met at the same diner. Brooklyn set a box on the table containing everything Ellis Ward had gathered on the Whitfield family. The medical records, the bank statements, the printed text messages, all of it. She told him to take everything, that she wasn't keeping anything back. Nolan leafed through the documents, then asked about the other part. Brooklyn said there was no other part. She said that for 9 years, everyone had told her that when someone helped her, she owed them something in return. That man was the only person who had never handed her a bill. "I have nothing to sell you," she said. Nolan looked at her for a long time. He didn't threaten her, and he didn't say another word about Winston Marchetti. He merely took out a business card, placed it on the table, and told her that if the day ever came when she changed her mind, the number would remain the same. Then he picked up the box and left. 9 days later, Brooklyn received a call from Bradley's phone. He spoke very quickly. He said Dot Pruitt was being held somewhere, that it was because of his debt, and that they had promised to release her if Brooklyn came. Brooklyn said she didn't believe him. Then Bradley gave her one detail: the tin box beneath the counter, in the second compartment from the left. Only 4 people in the world knew where that box was kept, and 3 of them were standing inside the diner at that very moment. She asked for the address. It was a warehouse in South Deering, near the Southern Harbor. Brooklyn knew it was a trap. She knew from the moment she ended the call until the moment she reached the parking lot. But Dot Pruitt was the only person in those 9 years who had never asked her for anything. And some debts were repaid, not because anyone had calculated what could be gained or lost. Brooklyn sent Winston a single message containing the address, then turned off her phone and drove away. Dot wasn't there. Inside the warehouse were only Milos Kovac, Ruben Castellano, 3 of their men, and Bradley Whitfield, standing in a corner like a man waiting to be paid. Kovac didn't shout. He invited Brooklyn to sit. He said he had nothing against her, that she was simply the only thing in this world capable of making Winston Marchetti sit down at a negotiating table. Winston arrived 20 minutes later. He walked in alone. He brought no one, and carried nothing. The phone in his pocket kept vibrating, and he took it out, saw Enzo Barone's name on the screen, then switched it off and put it away. Kovac named his price. Winston listened to all of it. Then he offered something no one in that room had imagined he would offer. He proposed surrendering complete control of the shipping routes at the southern harbor, something the Marchetti family had held for 20 years, something his father had built from the ground up. Castellano straightened. Kovac remained silent for nearly a minute, and throughout that minute, he looked at Winston as though the man had just ruined something immensely valuable. He asked whether she was worth that much. Winston said she was worth far more, but Kovac would never know how much more, because he possessed nothing against which her worth could be measured. Kovac let her go. The warehouse doors opened. Brooklyn walked out with Winston, and no one followed them. Bradley Whitfield remained in the corner of that warehouse, watching them leave. The merchandise he had delivered had been bought away from him, and his $400,000 debt was still there, untouched. Bradley ran after her into the parking lot. He called her name 3 times, and on the third, he dropped to his knees on the concrete. He truly cried, the way a man cries when he has just realized there is nowhere left for him to go. He said he had no one else. He said his mother wouldn't answer his calls. The company was gone, and Sloane had left, as though any of that were reason enough for Brooklyn to return. Brooklyn didn't shout at him. She bent down until her eyes were level with his, and spoke very softly. "For 9 years, you called me your wife," she said, "but you never once asked whether I was tired that day. You didn't lose me at that lake, Bradley. You never had me." Then she stood, walked to her car, and drove away. The trials were divided among 3 jurisdictions. The attempted murder charges belonged to the state of Wisconsin and were tried in Walworth County Court, where Marlene Whitfield received 22 years and Corey Whitfield received 18. The insurance fraud case went to federal court, and Bradley Whitfield was sentenced to 15 years. The falsification of medical records was prosecuted in Illinois, where Peter Lohman received 6 years and permanently lost his medical license. Vivian Whitfield received 3 years for obstruction of justice and lying to investigators, and her sentence was lighter than the other 3, for a reason no one had known until that moment. The video recording everything that happened on the dock on the morning of October 4th had been sent to federal authorities from an anonymous address 3 days after the memorial service at the Bridgeport Church. Vivian had sent it. She testified that she had been so terrified that morning she couldn't move, that she had pressed the record button only because her hand needed something to do, and that once it was over, she had been too afraid of her mother to speak. She kept the video for 3 months. She sent it only after she knew for certain that the woman in the recording was still alive. It was the only evidence that could convict all 4 of them. Brooklyn testified on the second day of the Walworth trial. She said they had succeeded in killing someone that day. She said the woman who believed she had to be useful in order to deserve love had been left beneath Lake Geneva. She said the woman standing there today understood something that woman hadn't known, that a person's worth wasn't measured by the balance in a savings account and couldn't be graded by anyone else. Then she stepped down from the witness stand. In September of the following year, Brooklyn visited Taycheedah Women's Prison exactly once. Vivian sat on the other side of the glass. She didn't apologize, and she didn't beg for anything. She asked only one question: who had paid for Hazel's heart surgery? Brooklyn looked at her for a long time. Then she rose and said, "The little girl is healthy now. You focus on finishing your program in here." She didn't answer the question, but Vivian had lowered her head onto the table before Brooklyn reached the door. Brooklyn forgave no one. She simply refused to become like them. 1 year later, Dot Pruitt retired. Brooklyn bought the diner with the exact $180,000 they had tried to kill her for. She kept the name Pruitt's on the sign. Winston Marchetti turned most of the business over to Enzo Barone. He didn't become a different man. His past couldn't be washed clean, and the file bearing his name still lay in a drawer somewhere inside a federal agency. They both knew that. He merely chose to step back, and he kept the one promise he had never spoken aloud. At 2 o'clock, one November morning, he entered the diner and sat on the last stool at the counter. Brooklyn placed a plate of eggs and toast before him, even though he hadn't ordered anything. He ate every bite. Then he pushed a ring toward her, without kneeling, without flowers, without a single prepared word. "I have nothing clean to offer you," he said. "I have only my word, and I've never broken it. You'll never have to wonder whether you're worthy again." Brooklyn picked up the ring, and the story of that woman leaves us with 3 lessons. First, never sign anything you haven't read, even when the person handing you the paper calls you her daughter. Second, someone who truly loves you will never make you prove that you're still useful. And third, an act of kindness offered to a stranger is never wasted. Its answer simply hasn't arrived yet. A person's worth doesn't lie in what they can provide for someone else. It lies in the simple fact that they are here. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to compelling stories together every day. How do you feel about everything Brooklyn endured? And is there anyone in your life who has ever had to prove their worth in order to be loved? Please leave a comment so we can hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.